name is Aida, and I work as software developer at ThoughtWorks. But prior to this role, I've spent 9 years working as a QA, and this is the reason why today I came to discuss the QA role. So before we begin, I would like to ask you to raise your hand if you work as a QA or a tester. Okay, just one. And do you work with a QA or a tester in your teams? Can you please raise your hand? Okay, that's a bit better. Good. So I hope you enjoy this talk. I'm going to start. So I would like to begin by sharing what has been my journey since I started working and until today. I studied telecommunications engineering, and during the last year of my degree, I decided that I wanted to pursue an internship. And the company I was hired by, they determined that I would excel as a test engineer, given I am very organized and I pay a lot of attention to detail. So this is how I began my career as a test engineer. At the moment, I didn't even know what a tester or a QA was, but I was thrilled and I was enjoying the work. When my internship finished, I got a job as a test engineer, and after that, I worked as a QA engineer for a couple more companies. And despite of the job title change, the job that I was doing remained relatively similar, so that was not really a significant change for me. However, that changed when I got my next job, when I was hired as a QA manager. At the beginning, I was the only QA of the company, so as you can imagine, I was functioning as another QA engineer. However, this time, the job that I was doing was completely different to what I was doing before. Then with time, the company decided that they wanted to expand the QA team, and I found myself transitioning from being an individual contributor to becoming a people manager, to the point where I didn't have time to be an individual contributor anymore. And even I was enjoying the challenges that came with being a QA manager, I was yet not ready to completely give up on the technical aspects. So after more than 3 years of being a QA manager, I decided to go back to being a QA engineer. And this is what I did for a few months. But then I realized that I needed a different kind of challenge. So I decided to change jobs, and I was hired as a QA lead in my current company at ThoughtWorks. And one more time, the job that I was doing was completely different to anything that I had done before. And I was even developing. And I think it is that what allowed me to approach testing in a completely different way. So I guess I was enjoying so much this new way of working that I decided to become a software developer. And this is what I've been doing until now. I am a software developer, but I still have a strong focus on testing. So in order to better understand my journey, what I would like to do next is to zoom out a little bit and divide the different QA roles that I've held in 3 primary phases. During the first phase, QA 1.0, I was working with Waterfall. And Waterfall doesn't really promote collaboration between developers and QAs. So as a result, I was feeling pretty isolated from the team. And during this time, my main job was doing manual testing. In the second phase, QA 2.0, I started working with Agile, particularly with Scrum. And this allowed me to be able to be involved in the whole development lifecycle and to feel part of the team. And during this time, I was still doing manual testing, but my focus shifted towards automation. In the last phase, the QA 3.0, I continued to work with Scrum, but I also adopted some extreme programming practices. And this enabled me to be able to start developing. And for the first time, I felt that I was part of the team, that I was working with the team. Quality was built in the team, and everyone was responsible for it, not just me. So now what I would like to do is I would like to go phase by phase and explain in detail how each of them worked. So we are going to start with the first level, the QA 1.0. The QA 1.0 works with Waterfall. Waterfall is a sequential model. That means that there are not going to be iterations. The project is going to be divided into 6 phases, and the idea is that you cannot move on to the next phase until you are completely done with the current phase. The first 2 phases are about defining what needs to be done and how. Then you implement the product, you test it, and you deliver it to the final users. And then there is a final phase of maintenance. So while the waterfall model is very straightforward and its phases are clearly defined, I think it has several drawbacks. The first one is that it is very rigid. You need to know very well what are your requirements at the beginning of the project, because you cannot change them later. And we all know that this is not how usually projects work. The second one is that testing comes after the whole development has been done. And this might lead to very late detection of bugs. In order to solve the later problem, some thought about implementing an iterative waterfall process. The idea behind the iterative waterfall is that there is an implementation phase that lasts for 2 or 3 months, followed by a testing phase of 15 days. And this testing phase is to be able to solve major bugs. And then you continue with implementation. So compared to the classic waterfall, this was an improvement because you don't have to wait till the end of the project to fix all the bugs. However, it was still very painful for both developers and QAs because testing still came after a very long phase of development. Additionally, there is another disadvantage that we haven't discussed yet, which is the lack of collaboration between developers and QAs. So why do you think this is happening? Well, this is because implementation and testing are 2 different phases that happen one after the other, and that doesn't really promote collaboration. This lack of collaboration is also reflected in the team topology, which many times looks like this. Here, the first thing that we notice is that the QA is not part of the development team. And the second thing is that it's giving support to all the developers. I like to call this the superhero QA. So this might not seem a realistic situation, but it happens frequently. I remember that I was once hired for a company that didn't have any QAs, and I was not only expected to give support to all the developers, but also to create a testing strategy for a project that had been developed for 3 years, more than 3 years. And I was expected to do it quickly. So here, what I want to highlight is that many times, many companies, when they hire the first QA, they implement topology like this. And this can be a nightmare for a QA who is new to a company, it has to test everything, and is officially not part of the development team. And this results in not having a lot of support to perform their jobs. So I think it's not the best strategy to hire someone and isolate them while expecting them to change how the whole department works. So fortunately, this is usually just a transitory state until the company can hire more QAs. And eventually, you reach a state when you only have to give support to 1 or 2 or 3 teams. So working like this is a relief. However, you still need to keep a lot of context and divide your time between teams, and that might not be easy. Now we'd like to talk about the responsibilities of the QA 1.0. But before we do that, let's super quickly introduce the testing pyramid, which is a tool to plan the testing strategy of a project. The original testing pyramid recommends testing at 3 different levels. At the bottom, we have unit tests. They are fast and they are cheap, so you should have many of them. Then we have the service tests. And at the bottom, we have the UI tests. They are slow and they are expensive, so you should have a limited number of them. So from all this pyramid, the QA 1.0 only focuses at the top of the pyramid, the UI tests. So why do you think this is happening? Well, this is because the QA 1.0 doesn't have knowledge about the internals of the application. So they test through the UI and doing manual tests. And this happens during the testing phase of the waterfall model. The lower part of the pyramid is testing the application from the inside. So those tests need to be automated. That's why developers are taking care of them, and they are doing that during the implementation phase of the waterfall model. So there are 2 important things that I would like to highlight here. The first one is that usually the pyramid resembles more to an ice cream cone, and this is because either there is not enough time for testing or testing is not given enough importance during the implementation phase, relying heavily on the tests performed during the testing phase. The second thing is that, well, according to this, it might seem that the QA is only working during the testing phase. However, this is not entirely true. The testing phase is only visualizing the test execution part that the QA is doing. However, the QA has other important responsibilities as well. And in order to understand those, we are going to review the testing life cycle. So this is the 4-phase testing life cycle that I was using when I was a QA 1.0. During the preparation phase, I reviewed requirements and understood the business rule. And this is a very important phase because as a QA 1.0, I was not part of the requirement analysis phase of the waterfall model, so I didn't have the details of how things worked. During the specification phase, I created the test cases using the test design techniques in order to ensure a good coverage, and I documented those test cases in a tool called the test management tool. And I don't know if you have worked with a tool like this, but it is very tedious, and it is long to do this, and it is boring, and yeah, I didn't like it at all. The execution phase involved manually executed the test defined in the previous phase, and then in the completion phase, I created a report with the results of all the executions. So, specification and preparation phases, they happen simultaneously while the implementation phase of the waterfall model was happening. And the execution and completion phases, they happen during the testing phase of the waterfall model. So here, we can clearly see that the waterfall model is not visualizing all the work that the QA is doing. And it is quite a lot of work, right? And everything had to be done manually. Nothing was automated. So I guess this might have been acceptable back in the 80s when UA automation tools like Selenium were not available. But I was a QA 1.0 9 years ago, I think. So I question myself, like, why was I working like this? Why did I spend hours writing manual test cases? Of course, because I didn't know better, but I really, really wish I did. So let's sum up a bit with the QA 1.0. The good is that my company provided me with formal training to learn about the foundations of testing. And this includes test types, test design techniques, and defect management. And I find this training very valuable because most of the QAs nowadays, they don't get this kind of formal learning, and instead they learn by doing. The bad is that feedback comes late in the process. There is lack of communication between developers and QAs, and also the testing strategy for the QAs is focused at the top of the pyramid and involves lots of manual testing. So now we are going to level up, and we are going to talk about the QA 2.0. So the QA 2.0 works with Agile, a methodology that is based on iterative development and self-organized cross-functional teams. And probably this is the biggest difference with the waterfall model. Scrum is probably the most popular and adopted Agile framework. Scrum is going to define the events that are going to happen, the roles inside the team, and the artifacts that the team is going to use. The development is going to be divided into sprints, and at the beginning of the sprint, the team is going to commit to finishing a certain amount of work. Then every day they are going to review the progress, and at the end of the sprint, they will showcase what they have achieved, and they will do a retrospective in order to talk about the things that they want to improve. So, as you can see, Scrum practices are quite simple to follow. However, it is important to note that while Scrum prescribes some practices, there are other important aspects that it does not address. The Scrum framework is incomplete, and that is on purpose, in order to give teams some flexibility. So, for instance, Scrum does not provide a solution on how to create a backlog of user stories, and many teams struggle funding this process. Another thing that teams struggle with is setting up their Scrum board. The most simple Scrum board has 3 columns: to do, in progress, done. That's it. However, this seems to be not enough for most of the team. And in fact, I have never worked with a 3-column Scrum board. At least the minimum thing that teams add is a column for QA. So let's see how this would work. Stories are going to be placed in to do when they are refined and ready to be picked. When the developer starts developing, they put in progress, and when they finish the development, they put in ready to QA. So as you can see, the ready to QA column is like a to-do column, but for QAs. When the QA starts testing, they put in QA, and when they finish the testing, they move to done. So let's analyze what is happening here. We had added 2 more columns, and now we have 2 clearly defined phases. One for development, one for testing. One for developers, one for QAs. So if we compare to the waterfall model, aren't we essentially doing the same thing? but at the story level, of course. And the answer is yes. We all know this, and this is why a lot of people is saying that Scrum is like a mini waterfall process. However, this is not a problem with Scrum itself, but how we implement it. Having a board like this brings several problems. The first one I already mentioned. Development and testing are two different phases that done by different people, and therefore the feedback comes late in the process. So imagine a developer finishes developing a story and they put it in ready to QA. The QA, when they have time, they pick the story and they start testing it. Imagine they find a bug, they open a bug. The developer, meanwhile, has started working in another story, and only when they have time, they will work in the bug. They work in the bug, they fix the bug. Meanwhile, the QA has started working in something else. And it's not only after they finish this something else that they will pick the bug, they test it, they finish testing the story, they can close it. So this back and forth process results in a lot of ping pong and delays in the overall process. Additionally, we have the time that the QA needs to spend opening bugs. And finally, if a team only has one QA, testing can quickly become a bottleneck. Let's now talk about team topology. So Scrum is going to define 3 different roles. The product owner is the person that represents the customer and the stakeholders, and we need to work with them in order to understand what needs to be done and what the priorities are. The Scrum Master is the person that is going to ensure that the team is doing Scrum properly and following the Scrum values. And the development team are the people who actually deliver the project. And here we can find developers, QAs, UX people, and any other role that we need to deliver. Okay? Outside the team, then, we have the stakeholders. These are the people that have an investment or interest in the project, and the PO should work with them in order to represent their interests. So the good thing about this team structure is that the QA now is part of the development team. And I remember how happy I was when I started working with Scrum, because suddenly I was not alone anymore. I had a team that was working with me and supporting me. And even though I was still in charge of doing the testing and they were still in charge of doing the development, our communication and collaboration improved significantly. If we now talk about my responsibilities as a QA 2.0, they shifted from doing manual testing to also doing automation. So for every story, the approach was as follows. I would first manually test it and open bugs if there was any, and then I would automate some test cases in order to create a regression that I could run at any given time. So as a QA 2.0, I was testing many different types of tests. End-to-end UI tests, end-to-end API tests, cross-browser tests, cross-device tests, even visual tests. But my focus was still at the top of the pyramid. And I was doing this work during the QA column. I still couldn't write tests at the lower part of the pyramid because I didn't have knowledge on how the application worked. So that's why developers were still in charge of doing this part, and they did that during the in-progress column. So if we now compare to waterfall, it feels like we are doing the same thing. No, the only difference is that we are automating. Well, this is not entirely true. The problem with the waterfall model is that it was only visualizing the test execution part that the QA was doing. However, that we know that this is not like this because we saw the testing lifecycle. So let's see how this testing lifecycle would play in an agile environment. The preparation phase no longer needed. The QA is now part of the sprint planning when everybody in the team understands what needs to be done. The specification and execution phases, they are going to happen in parallel. And I will explain in a bit how exactly. Okay? And then the completion phase, the QA doesn't need to do anything specific for this one, because now, every time there is a push, the tests are going to run, and a report is going to be automatically generated. And all of this work is going to happen while the story is in the QA. Okay, so now there is no hidden work that the QA is doing and no one is seeing. Let's see how this specification and execution phases work. So manual testing is going to be conducted through exploratory tests. And this does not mean that we're not going to plan our test cases. It means that we're going to do it on the fly. And we're going to use mind maps in order to do it in a very, very lightweight. Because the objective is to maximize the test execution part, which is the one that gives us value. When we are done with manual testing, we're going to move on to automated testing. We are going to use the mind maps with the test cases that we designed, and we're going to choose the ones that we want to automate, and we're going to automate them. This time, we don't need to create any documentation because the code is going to be our documentation. And we also don't need to create any report because it's going to be automatically generated. So here, I want to compare a bit the QA 1.0 and the QA 2.0. If you realize about it, this is like a recipe. No? The QA 1.0 had a recipe that was following blindly. However, we all know, if we cook, that you cannot follow recipes blindly because the kitchen is going to be different or the ingredients they're going to be slightly different. So the QA 2.0 is not following a recipe blindly. What they are doing is they are exploring and adapting the recipe to the environment. And this is the change. So let's sum up a little bit with the QA 2.0. The good thing is that we are doing Scrum and we have earlier feedback because we are testing at the end of the story. And also we have improved the collaboration and communication since the QA is part of the team. Moreover, the testing strategy now focuses at the top of, the testing strategy focuses on automation. The bad is that the way in which we do Scrum, it feels like a mini waterfall. The feedback still comes late because we are testing at the end of the story, and there is a still lack of communication between developers and the QAs because the QA has different goals and is working in different things. And also the testing strategy is still focused at the top of the pyramid. So now we're going to level up again to QA 3.0, and this is going to change everything because we're going to build a quality mindset. And once you're here, I think you're going to love it. So the QA 3.0 continues to work with Scrum, but as I mentioned earlier, a Scrum framework has some gaps that need to be addressed. So what we're going to do is that we're going to add a few processes in order to fill some of those gaps. The first one is going to be a discovery process. The idea is that every feature is going to have two phases. A discovery phase, which will help us understand and where we will define what needs to be done, and an execution phase, where we execute or where we develop what we have defined. The PO is going to be the one driving the discovery process, and they are going to involve the stakeholders and one or two technical team members, which we are going to call the feature leads. The output is going to be a list of prioritized user stories created collaboratively by the PO and the feature leads. And in my opinion, involving feature leads or technical team members in the story writing process results in better written stories, less open questions, and therefore less blockers during development. We're also going to introduce tech huddles. This is our 15-minute meeting that happens right after the daily, and its purpose is to allow technical team members to have some time to discuss technical findings, blockers, and all of this while promoting collaboration and knowledge sharing. We are also going to add some changes to the Scrum board that we saw before. We're going to remove the QA columns, and we're going to add a new column, the stakeholder validation. So let's see how this board would work. Stories are going to stay in progress where they are developed and tested, and until they are deployed in production and tested in a deployed environment. And only after that, we can move to the next column. The stakeholder validation column is for stakeholders to be able to do some final validation of the story in a deployed environment. So in our case, we are a consultancy, and the PO, the data people, and the UX people, they are from the client. So they wanted to have a final validation in the story before closing it, so we enabled this column for them. So for instance, the PO might check the functionality, the UX might verify the designs, and data people might test the tracking. And then once the validation is done, we can move the story to done. And of course, if you have a technical story, maybe you don't need this column. That's totally fine. So now, if we map these columns to the waterfall phases, we can see that implementation, testing, and deployment are all happening during the in-progress column. So what do we want to achieve by removing the QA column? We want to allow development and testing to be done simultaneously by the same people, and this is going to increase commitment. By working like this, we are going to get faster feedback, and we are going to remove the ping-pong effect. So imagine that I find a bug. I can directly fix it without having to spend time opening the bug or without losing any context. And also, we are going to remove the testing bottleneck, because now everyone can test. As a QA 3.0, I also adopted some extreme programming practices. Extreme programming is an agile framework that focuses on delivering high-quality software. Extreme programming is a very prescriptive framework with many, many practices, and this is by no means a complete list of all of them. These are just some of the practices that I adopted as a QA 3.0, and the ones that I believe completely changed the way in which I was working. The first one is pair programming. The idea is that team members do not work alone. Every task or story is going to be assigned to a pair of team members, and they are going to develop and test it together. And the QA is also going to be part of one of those pairs, and they are going to work in a task, developing and testing it. And I think this is a very important change. So why do I think QAs need to develop? A lot of people think it's not necessary, but I completely disagree. I think being able to develop is going to allow you to approach testing in a completely different way, a better way. If you're able to develop, you will be able to create tests at the lower part of the pyramid. Remember the fast and cheap ones, reducing the need of hundreds of tests at the top of the pyramid. Remember the expensive and slow ones. The pair that is doing the development is also going to be doing the testing. And I think this is a crucial step towards building a quality mindset. Everyone needs to start testing, whether manual or automated. And now you might think, but well, Aida, developers are not as good as QAs testing. And I disagree once again. I think they usually rely on someone else to do it, and that's why they don't do it, or they don't do enough of it. And now you might be thinking as well, but I think the QA has bigger context, and therefore they can test better. But think about it. If you are developing something, I think you should understand very well what it is that you're doing. Otherwise, how can you get it right? No? So I think everyone in the team should have this bigger context, not just the QA. Let's switch to TDD. The idea is that you first create your test, then the code to make the test pass, and then you refactor. And I think this is another very important practice in order to build a quality mindset, because you are going to start thinking about testing even before coding. The last practice is collective ownership. The idea is that any team member should be able to change any line of code to add functionality, fix a bug, and do a refactor, whatever. No one should be a bottleneck for changes. In order to achieve this collective ownership, you should have a very good knowledge of the different areas of the application. And some ways in which you can achieve that is by sharing knowledge, for example, using your tech huddles, by creating coding conventions, and also by working in many, many different stories. So, for example, if you pair in your team, make sure that you switch pairs often. I know people want to stay in the same story from the beginning till the end, but I want to encourage you not to do that, because you can bring new ideas to your stories and you get to learn about many, many different things. So, for example, in my team, we switch pairs every Monday and Wednesday. It takes a bit of time to get used to that, but I think then it works pretty, pretty well. Okay, let's now talk about team topology. So there are no changes this time. The QA is still part of the development team. So probably the biggest difference is that now the responsibilities of the developer and the responsibilities of the QA are going to merge. Because the QA now is going to have the same responsibilities of a developer. They're going to develop and they're going to test. And they're going to test at all levels of the pyramid. And for the first time, the pyramid is going to stop looking like an ice cream cone. And all of this is going to happen while the story is in progress, because testing is part of the development. The development is not finished until the testing is finished. So in order to make this work, I think it is very important that you spend some time defining your testing strategy and your testing pyramid. And now I guess you might be wondering, but if developers are testing, why do we need QAs? Well, I think the QA is the person that has deeper knowledge on testing, and they can bring this knowledge to the team, the same way that it is beneficial to have a developer with more knowledge on infrastructure, or a developer that is more specialized in backend or in frontend. So let's sum up a bit. We have added some practices in order to fill some of the gaps that the Scrum framework has. And we have added some practices, some extreme programming practices, in order to help us build a quality mindset. Now we have very early feedback, and now we have lots of communication between developers and QAs. And for the first time, the team has a well-balanced testing strategy, one that is not focused at the top of the pyramid. The bad is that this way of working is not for everyone. It requires a very mature team. Plus, not everyone likes doing TDD, and not everyone likes pairing. Also, when I was working like this, there were other set of practices that were helpful to build a quality mindset. Those are chunk-based development, feature toggles, and continuous deploy. And in order to do a continuous deploy, we had a very, very good testing coverage. Also, this is going to be reaching this state is going to be hard. For you as a QA, it's going to be hard to learn to do TDD and to start developing. And you're going to need a lot of support, because I remember that what it used to be my main job as a QA 2.0 was then a very little part of my job as a QA 3.0. So I had to basically relearn everything. For you as a developer, it's also going to be difficult to get into the habit of testing and testing at all the different layers, and also to learn how to think about all the edge cases. So, cool. Now we are a QA 3.0, and we are ready to face Browser. That is amazing. And you might be wondering, but Aida, how can I get there? Well, if you are a QA 1.0, I would like to encourage you to start transitioning towards a 2.0 now, because I think no one should be stuck in this phase, because being a QA can be a lot more enjoyable and fun. If you are a QA 2.0, I think that's okay. I think this is where most of the people is. I think Scrum brings a structure to the team, and then doing automation is a lot more fun than manual testing. However, I still would like to challenge you, or your QAs in your team, to become a QA 3.0, because I want them to stop acting as a gate for quality. So in my experience, and with the knowledge that I have today, the QA 3.0 is the optimal stage. And I've gathered some tips in order to help you make the transition, or help your QAs make the transition. Okay, so we can start by creating a shared goal. Usually, developers' goal is to deliver, and QA's goal is to test or build quality. Let's instead create a shared goal, building quality software. And I want you to tell this to your QAs to stop working alone in initiatives to improve quality and involve the rest of the team, because the QA 3.0 works with the team, and they emphasize collaboration and teamwork. And spend some time defining your testing strategy and your testing pyramid, because that way you're going to be aligned on how to approach testing. I think it is crucial to have well-defined user stories in order to build a quality mindset. These stories are small, with clear and complete information, and no open questions. They should have all the acceptance criteria, and I also find that adding some notes on how to test might be beneficial. And it is essential that everyone in the team understands those stories, so do not skip refinements. Include practices like TDD and pairing. With TDD, you're going to start thinking about testing even before coding. And with pairing, we are going to have another pair of eyes looking at your code. Plus, I think it's an excellent tool in order to share knowledge and grow more junior team members. Dedicate enough time to testing, because testing is important. Automate as much as you can. You don't want to be doing boring, manual, repetitive tasks. And finally, invest on making testing easier, because that way you're not going to have any excuse not to do it. So finally, I guess this is the question that everyone wants me to answer. Let me do that by explaining why I became a developer. After working as a QA 3.0, I realized that I loved it. It was clearly the optimal way, so there was no way that I could go back to being a QA 2.0. But I knew that if I changed teams or companies, I would probably have to. So I decided to become a developer. That way I could keep on developing and testing. And as a developer, I started in a new team, a team without a QA. And it went pretty well. So I started thinking a lot about the QA role. What's wrong with it? Do we really need QAs? And this was these were pretty tough questions to ask to myself. So I think that the problem is, how do we bring the role of the QA to the teams? We don't bring a QA when there is no problem in the team. We bring a QA when there is a quality problem. And when they join the team, we don't give them enough support. So it is very hard to improve quality in a setup like this. So this is why when I was working in a team without QA, I didn't feel that I needed one, because everyone in the team cared about quality, and we had practices and processes to support the quality mindset. So I think we don't need the role of the QA in the team. What we need is the testing knowledge, and we need everyone in the team to have that knowledge. And of course, if you want to achieve that, if you want to reach that state, you can bring someone with a QA background to the team, or a developer with a strong focus on testing. So I guess my answer to this question is like everything in life. It depends if you want to improve quality, but this is just the responsibility or the goal of the QA, then the answer is yes. Having a QA is a symptom of a dysfunctional team. If you want to improve quality, quality needs to be a priority, and it needs to be a priority for everyone, not just the QA. Thank you. So I guess we have some time for questions. Does anyone have any question?
I've been thinking a lot about this kind of like the advice coming from you with more than 10 years of experience compared to someone who is completely new to the industry, coming in as a newbie and needs to learn. Would you give the complete newbie the exact same advice as coming from your experience where you kind of built this over the years?
I mean, I think yes. If you can go directly to being a QA 3.0, I would totally recommend that. However, I don't regret going through this stage, because I think I got a lot of learning from it. So, I guess. Are there more questions? Yep. Sorry, can you speak up a bit? I cannot hear. How many team members? Yeah, well, I know quite a lot of people who went through this path. Maybe not the whole path, but I know a lot of people that was doing manual testing. They switched to QA 2.0 to automate and to do a Scrum, because like doing manual testing, it is very, very boring, and it's not optimal. Then I know some people when I was working in Typeform, many of the QAs that were working there with me, they decided to become developers because they wanted to, go to the next stage. I also know of developers that became QAs, particularly one because they wanted to be able to influence how the QAs work and, became QA, make the QAs or help the QAs to become a QA 3.0. So, you're welcome. No more questions? Okay. Then thank you very much.